Hello, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today with me is one of my favorite guests, one of my favorite strategists in Europe, Velina Tchakarova from Vienna. Hi, Velina. Hi, how are you?
Hi, it's great to be back, Jacek. It's such a great pleasure and big honor to be a guest to your show, and I look forward to a very interesting conversation.
Perfect. Likewise, from my side, from my end. We haven't talked on the record in a few months. Uh, I don't need to clarify that a lot of things have happened meanwhile. Yeah, we always talk about grand strategies, geopolitics, great power game in Eurasia. Now we have the war in Ukraine. How would you start our conversation if you were to choose the most important event or the most important change or the most important topic that should be, well addressed? So, what would you start with?
Well, I will start with what we in the German speaking world tend to describe as my Weltschmerz. That means a kind of state of frustration when you simply perceive things differently from, let's say, the majority of experts and political decision makers. And I will start, of course, with my main topic, that is the bifurcation of the global system. I have been arguing for a year now that Russia's war against Ukraine is the manifestation of this bifurcation, that Russia actually sided with China prior to taking the decision to make a make a move on Ukraine to launch a full-scale war. And China also sided with Russia. We've seen this. We have plenty of evidence. Meanwhile, but this was my main thesis even before the war. So practically, one of I think. And this is my personal assessment, of course, we can discuss that. But one of, I think, the main correct estimations by the Russian president was that once China is faced with reality on the ground, because I'm pretty much sure that uh, there was a kind of conversation about some plans, but certainly the Russians kept the Chinese in the dark about the real intentions. But I think that the Russian president was correct in his estimation that once China is being presented with the facts on the ground, there is no way that China would allow, let's say, a three fronts scenario with the military escalation in Taiwan, with military tensions along the line of actual control with India, and then to have practically a third front opening up in the north of its borders and having this security vacuum. So the Chinese had to support. And what we are meanwhile seeing is, of course, a big discussion about about whether Beijing will provide military assistance to Moscow, because this will be next level of escalation. Why? Because first, it will mark the end of Russia as a global power. That means the status of being a global power will be erased. Second, because it will mark the beginning of a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, with the United States and China taking sides and supporting one of these, one of the parties in this military conflict. And third, because it will significantly change, of course, the equation, and we may see then a prolongation of a already war of attrition. So all in all, as seen from from a European perspective, this is all bad news for us here in Europe, as I've been saying for quite some time now, that what we are doing here, not trying to actually again confront it with geopolitical realities, to face them the way they are, to actually admit finally that a non-kinetic war was also launched against us here in Europe, against the European security order, that this is part of something bigger, of the long game, if you like. And by doing so, Russia was actually, pursuing a better positioning in this newly emerging systemic conflict. Then again, as I said, what we are seeing as a manifestation of a Cold War 2.0 scenario is practically that the United States is doing everything to prevent the emergence of two-front scenario with Russia and China, the dragon bear, practically merging into a modus vivendi of coordination. And at the same time, China is doing everything to prevent a three-front scenario from happening with, comprehensive support for Moscow. And I will stop here.
Okay, but can we be more granular? So how is the United States conducting the foreign policy of trying to avoid the two-front war? And, how do you read? With what do you read? By what events do you read it like that? Or how those intentions manifest themselves? And the second, how the Chinese are trying to avoid the less the least plausible scenario for them. How you put it at the end of your opening remarks.
Well, when it comes to the United States, it's quite obvious that they've decided at the early stage of the war that they need to provide all the necessary support for Ukraine. So we've seen actually that if it had not been for the United States, Ukraine would have actually capitulated. We know that for a fact, meanwhile. And it was the United States that took the leadership. Yes, of course, in the first critical phase, it was the Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainian will to fight, and war is always about the will to fight, and this hasn't changed after a year. But of course, I mean the material support, the military support. It came first and foremost from the United States. It took the leadership position. This is what I mean that there was this clear long-term oriented decision that they need to, on the one hand, support Ukraine by all means, but also do everything possible to weaken Russia, to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. And of course, what we've seen afterwards is that the Europeans followed suit and started also providing. But more or less, once again, even though that it's actually the largest and the most comprehensive war taking place on the old continent since the end of the Second World War, it is the Americans once again that taking the leadership, and this says a lot. It actually says also that the whole question about the European strategic sovereignty has died on the 24th of February last year. That is my reading.
We will talk about the.
But we will talk about that. Yes.
About France and Germany and about the shift, we will talk. But if you could also say a few things about China and
yes,
their worst dreams.
When it comes to China, of course, let's say the main expectation with Biden's becoming the new president was actually that they will have rather a phase of normalization in the bilateral relationship, even though that this mutual decoupling has been already ongoing. It is not, when we talk about decoupling, you should not see it only as a unilateral effort coming from Washington. In fact, China has been preparing for this decoupling, let's say not with the same speed, with the same scope, but certainly with the same political motivation, and following, of course, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, where Xi Jinping could cement his power within the echelons of, the Communist Party, but also the different layers of, power. Was absolutely clear that after this important domestic event, the most important, once again they will actually focus on on foreign policy. And here there is this clear understanding that things have been amplified, triggered, that there is actually a similar readiness on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, to actually face the biggest geopolitical challenge, that is China. And that is why I've been arguing, in fact, for the last 10 years, that this modus vivendi of coordination that has been built up slowly but surely in all strategic domains between China and Russia, in fact, is favorable to Chinese interests. China needs this, let's say, predictable partner with significant regional power projection in all corners of the world, with this, let's say, significant diplomatic. Pardon?
And nuclear triad.
Next to it, I mean, I'm not going obviously to point to the obvious leverage. I'm just pointing to these layers that are also critical to China. I mean, China will need a kind of a global mercenary power that steps in every time when Chinese economic interests are at stake. I mean, think about Central Asia. Think about the Eurasian landmass, where there will be this geopolitical task of stabilizing the region, preventing external actors from entering when it comes to, let's say, economic interests, and all of this cannot be dealt by China on its own. So China needs this partner. So it's not just about, creating a significant counterweight to the American global power projection. This is, of course, task number one. It's not only about surviving this transitionary period of the international relations by backing each other. This is task number two, because you create a kind of modus vivendi where you also project a lot of political, even if it's fake. We can of course discuss that, but you have a political backing for the other leader, who can actually translate this then into a domestic clout, as we've seen this, from the last year. You don't have only these two tasks. You have the task of, stabilizing and controlling, in fact, the whole Eurasian landmass, Central, South Asian, meanwhile also Western Asian part of Asia. And then the fourth one, which is a big question mark, and yet I think is going to be also part of the agenda, is to get an entry ticket to the Arctic via Russia, because Russia is this entry ticket for China to become an Arctic nation and build an alternative maritime route to the US-controlled Indo-Pacific lines. That is actually the very short wrap-up for you. So all in all, China is actually quite interested in the current development, so long as Russia is keeping busy the Americans and the Europeans on the old continent, and practically is using this break to prepare accordingly. Second, it has already kind of tried to present itself as a constructive player of the international relations. That means if things really go south for Russia, it will give up on Russia and it will present itself as this mediator who provided 12 points peace plan, who is ready to step in Ukraine and participate in the reconstruction. So they have a plan B, but the plan, the main plan still remains actually supporting Russia by all means.
Yeah, I have two comments, if I may, to that. Still, the Chinese apparently have not made a decision to provide a full-scale land lease to support the Russian military adventure in Ukraine, and that would maybe trigger the World War if they meant. First of all, they could sustain the war by providing weapons and industrial parts, and second, I think that would trigger the U.S. response. And the Chinese, I'm not sure if you comply with what I'm saying, but the Chinese are very cautious, and they are not moving manifestly, at least, to show that they really think about doing it. And the second thing is that still, in terms of the Russian-Chinese cooperation, still I suspect that Putin's decision to move on Kiev and seize Kiev was, in fact, the move that was supposed to ameliorate also the Russian position vis-a-vis China in the new great power game in Eurasia. So I think that the Russians long-term decided to side with the continental Europeans and create one geopolitical bloc from Vladivostok to Lisbon, and not to be with China in the long run. Okay? But they wanted to leverage the Chinese rise to have a better negotiating position with the continental Europeans, but in the process, they had to eradicate the American influence in Europe. That's why they attacked Ukraine, to stabilize the periphery, to impose the will on Central and Eastern Europe, to create the control zones in Eastern and Central Europe, and also to destroy the credibility of the United States power projection in Eurasia. So they wanted to shoot three turkeys in one shot, but also to improve their position vis-a-vis China. And now, because they are not winning this war, they are falling into the hands of the Chinese mandarins in Beijing, becoming a sort of a client state in the long run. What do you think about my comments? You're muted, Velina. You're muted, apparently.
These are, yes, I always mute myself while, of course, the host is speaking. These are some interesting ideas. In fact, I partially agree on the topic of how to control certain flows of let's say goods and services from the east to the west. That means from Asia to Europe, because obviously if Putin is successful in Ukraine, he would launch a large geopolitical bloc with Belarus, with Ukraine, probably with other parts of Eastern Europe, such as in Transnistria, in Georgia, and then it will enable him to practically control this flow. So it's not going to be obviously only about cooperation, but it will create a bigger leverage towards China, which has been trying to penetrate the soft belly of Europe, obviously in Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, Central Europe. That was clear from the beginning of the launch of the so-called Belt and Road, and then of course the 16 and then later 70+1 initiative, which meanwhile is 14+1. Now I still think that and here we agree. Obviously, it was also about pushing away the Americans, but I think that Putin's reading was a different one, namely that he was foreseeing actually that it's only a matter of time for America to withdraw from the old continent. So a huge vacuum was about to emerge, and actually by subjugating the second largest country in Europe, Putin sought to fill this vacuum, this geopolitical vacuum, to actually reshape completely the European security order, which was detrimental to the Russian interests. So once again, on the one side, you create a bigger leverage in Europe towards your bigger partner, because everyone was describing Russia as a junior partner in the Dragonberry relationship. So even as a junior partner, you certainly have a big leverage, big geopolitical and geoeconomic leverage. And second, you actually don't want to work with all European partners. You don't want actually to have a strategic partnership with them. You want to create a concept of European powers as of 19th century. In this concept of of European powers, you actually engage with those that are Russia friendly. You build smaller 2, 3, so to say, states formations and constellations, and then work against your enemies. Specifically here, of course, it's about the big newly emerging Iron Curtain, obviously from the north along the eastern flank, and then connecting the Mediterranean, moving towards the Indo-Pacific maritime lines, the most important trading routes for Europe. So you control, practically you secure your own trade routes, which are, of course, in the Black Sea, with the Black Sea being the biggest choke point actually for a lot of commodities that come from Russia. And at the same time, you have a leverage against the enemy. So in fact, I don't think that there was any intention of creating a new partnership. Once you push away the Americans, you create a new partnership with the Europeans. I think it was a very clear, kind of revisionist thinking, in a way that you want a completely new European security order. And I would even go further by saying that it was, I think, the last push by the dying Russian Empire for geopolitical relevance. So we saw that every time when there was a big, war, an empire died on the old continent. And I think our last sick man in Europe now tried, something so desperate as a last push for geopolitical relevance.
Yeah, so I fully agree. Now the question is, and we will be moving towards the continental game, and since you're based in Vienna, Austria, speaking German, so you know the German-speaking world very well, and to the dismay of many Germans and many German elites, Russia is simply collapsing. And of course, here in Central Eastern Europe, we want to see them collapse and even disintegrate. And basically, I think that this is the objective of the Ukraine military. And of course, the question is how much they will manage to leverage this against the Americans, so that the Americans could help them all the way. For sure, that's why Poles are building the military as well. But tell us more about the debate in Germany. Are the Germans really seeing this happening, or they are still blinded and they still think that they will carry through their will against Central and Eastern Europeans, and Russia will still be somewhere there to cooperate with after the war? Do Germans understand that this is a bifurcation of the system, that maybe the World War is coming, and that the times have changed dramatically, and there is no comeback to the previous times? If you could, elaborate on that, Velina, it would be very much welcome.
Well, this is a big question, that I have provided just recently. I've provided some answers to. In fact, I've just published a piece for the biggest Indian think tank, ORF, and I presented it in India, where I argue that we are actually entering a scenario of Europe's bifurcation because of all these systemic processes that are taking place right now at the top of the system, at the top of the global affairs. They are also having significant ramifications for the European affairs, and one of these, unfortunately, I think, most negative trends is practically this, splitting of Europe into two major blocks, into an Anglosphere and Franco-German bloc, because of the way how they approach, the war in Ukraine, how they actually consider what's important to be done to support Ukraine, but also because of the approach of the two blocs to Russia and China, to the Dragon Bear. So, in a sense, this dividing line, I think, is the most dangerous one, and it has very much to do with, domestic politics, obviously. I still don't see this sense of urgency when it comes to the criticality of the situation and some of the topics we've already covered. So long as the decision makers, and specifically this is the case in the German-speaking world, don't want to admit, but not totally, actually, I would say that in most parts of Europe, don't want to admit that we are in this, non-kinetic war that's been launched on us, considering commodities, information warfare, nuclear blackmail, migration blackmail, and so on and so forth. I don't need even to count all of the examples because we've seen that for the last 12 months. And yet, political decision makers don't want to admit that we are in the middle of that. We are not even allowed to use the word war, even though that war has so many dimensions, not just the one that is being fought by military means. Second important point is that there is still no strategic consensus about the ultimate goal in this war. Is it just that we are going to provide only enough weapons to Ukraine so that Ukraine is able to sustain the next military offensive by Russia? Or isn't it actually more important to agree that the ultimate goal should be to provide as much as possible so that Ukraine actually wins the war? We don't have this strategic consensus. And here in the German-speaking world...
Why do you think, what is the reason behind it? Why don't we have this consensus? Why? What are the dividing lines?
There are many issues. First, because population.
Not the single one, and we cheat ourselves that there are many. The single one that some countries do not want to see Russia lose.
Absolutely. It starts with the fact that Russia should not be humiliated, or Russia should not be dissolved, or Russia should not lose the war, beyond whatever borders they don't even agree on the borders issue. That means that Ukraine has communicated a very clear war goal, and that is to restore its borders per 1991. These are the borders that actually were not only internationally recognized, they were recognized by Russia. So even this is a big issue, because it would include Crimea, also the territories of Crimea and those that were under Russian control prior to 24th of February. So even this is a still issue. We don't have a clear communication. When there is no clear strategic communication, this creates a vague space that is used by politicians, used by activists, used by all the interest groups, lobby groups, and so on and so forth. We've seen that these are two big issues. It is the issue about the future of Russia, where of course those mostly in Eastern Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, in the North, are convinced that it is actually the ultimate goal of Ukraine that needs to be shared also by the Europeans. We need to provide not just enough, but as much as possible to Ukraine, for Ukraine to win in this phase. Because if we actually lose, and this is my personal assessment, of course, if we lose the momentum, if we actually don't use this window of opportunity in the next 6 to 9 months, then both United States and Russia, obviously as well, are entering election campaigns, presidential election campaigns, and things will dramatically shift when it comes to the political support from the United States, because it's going to be only about winning the presidential election. And then again, we know for a fact that Europeans are just too slow in their reaction for, let's say, the next cycle of military aid. The second important thing is, I think that it has a lot to do also with the attitude towards the United States, where we see that specifically here in the German-speaking world, there is still this kind of specific perception of the United States. We've seen this with the debate on the Nord Stream 2.0. We've seen this with many issues, that now there is this narrative, for instance, being presented by political forces, by activists, and so on, that the United States is this big winner, that this is also NATO, Russia war, and so on.
That's what they say these days, yeah?
Yes. It is a conviction that it was in the interest of the United States to actually bomb the to conduct the explosion of the Nord Stream pipelines and so on and so on. There is no serious debate about anything whatsoever. I mean, here in Austria, there is not even a single security debate on whatever issue. I mean, not even on the specifics of the war.
What about the German-speaking world thinking about Poland's stance, huge military reform, and so on? What do they say about it, and our active role in supporting Ukraine?
Well, first, we've seen, of course, a significant shift. We have to admit that this has been an absolute quantum leap in the German, politics, to actually see these kind of debates that were started with the German Chancellor. By the German Chancellor already last year, with the Zeitenwende, with the epochal changes, with the intentions to invest in defense, in the defense sector, and so on and so forth. So there is a serious debate about all of these issues, about how to invest, what to invest, where to invest. There are many debates taking place, organized by, of course, think tanks, mostly also by the experts on not just Russia, but thankfully Eastern Europe. So we have more voices. There are more narratives being shaped in the public. There is, the public is opening up to these debates. But then again, you see also movements such as the Manifest for Peace, where practically activists and political parties representatives are actually rooting for more or less a ceasefire, peace negotiations, and all of this. So there is still kind of a very big dichotomy. So it will be unfair to say that it's only the debate is taking place only on the one side of the story, but it considers both sides. But it is a very about the fine balancing between these two big stories, and I just don't see how this will be merged into one coherent approach in the future. They have a new defense minister. He's obviously also constrained by the realities within his portfolio. So there are, for me personally, more question marks rather than answers right now as to how they want to take the lead. And I think this is the biggest problem right now, because obviously we need, within the European gang, the European group of member states, we also need a leader who shows the way, next to the Americans. And there is this kind of perception right now that there is no such leader. I mean, that Germany is reluctant to take the lead, and that France is struggling with its, own kind of perception, self-perception, because it's often wants to lead probably in the wrong way. It's not somehow accepted by the rest of the group, and then we have this significant power shifts within Europe when it comes to the field of security and defense. That means that they are moving eastwards, that they are moving towards the border with Ukraine. And for me here, once again, another big question mark is whether we will not see unanticipated consequences of all this vacuum that is emerging. For instance, in terms of Ukraine kind of joining a political alliance with certain member states that will accelerate the integration.
Poland. Yeah, with Poland, for example, military alliance.
I mean, Poland is obviously my number one, where I've been even arguing that we may see something absolutely unprecedented, unthinkable, unthinkable. I'm not saying that, and I'm not implying that this is taking place. I don't want to create any confusion, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a kind of, and that very much depends on the way how the war will continue in the next months, where we see a kind of political confederation, a sort of political alliance where Ukraine practically joins, Poland, so that it can become part of the European Union and NATO, similar to the 1990s reunification of Germany, where practically the way how Germany was, was not just reunified, but the way how the Democratic Republic of Germany was integrated was because of the reunification. It was not ready for, to be part of these structures, the transatlantic structures, but it was actually integrated thanks to the Federal Republic of Germany. So I think that we have to be a little bit more unorthodox because of the vast changes happening here in Europe. And all of this, I argue, is being created by this enormous security vacuum that has emerged and is pushing countries to sometimes even, let's say, desperate actions. I mean, it looks like it's a desperate action, but it's probably the only thing that you can do at the moment to secure your existence, territorial integrity, and so on.
Yeah, that is true. I'm just want to tell you that there are voices here in Warsaw that Biden, when he came over recently to Warsaw and gave his speech, he was discussing a complete new security architecture in Europe with a prominent role of Poland. And just I'm saying, okay, thank you, Velina. That was always, very interesting and fulfilling. Maybe let's agree to talk in 2 months' time again, just since you're always shedding the light from the German-speaking world, which is always interesting, especially for Poles, I must tell you. For some reason, both the German-speaking world cannot see through the wall to see what Poles are thinking, and also that works in the opposite direction. It's much easier to get access to the English, Anglo-Saxon thinking, strategic thinking by us. Thank you very much. Velina Tchakarova was my guest today. Thank you, Velina.
Thank you, Jacek.